and engagement, it gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished chair, fellow scholars, and participants who have joined us through Zoom and are watching us live on YouTube. We are thrilled to have you join us today at International Young Scholars Summit 2020. This international forum aims to bring together rigorous and erudite young scholars from all around the world over a single platform. The main aim is to create an academic space to encourage young scholars, academicians from the field of international relations, political science, diplomacy, public policy, administration, and related subfields. The conference will be held for 3 days consecutively through 30 different sessions and two parallel sessions, white and green room, running simultaneously through the conference. The conference will feature 275 scholars from 25 different countries who will be delivering their presentations and sharing their understanding with us. The session is streaming live on a YouTube, so please feel free to share it on your social media handle with the hashtag IYSS2020. This is the sixth session of the conference. To chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Ms. Dildukshi Handuneti here with us. Dildukshi Handuneti is a multiple award-winning investigative journalist, counting 25 years in journalism. She currently serves as an executive director at the Center for Investigative Reporting, Sri Lanka, the country's first center dedicated to promoting investigative reporting. A lawyer by training, she studied journalism at the School of Authentic Journalism, Mexico, and Tony Sebel Center for Investigative Reporting at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, USA. Prior to setting up CIR, she served as consultant editor of the Daily Express and Weekend Express, Sri Lanka's first international newspapers, published in collaboration with the New York Times. Her work has appeared in Al Jazeera, UK Guardian, Anadolu, The Humanitarian, Reuters, Alernet, Science DevNet, Bharat ETV, Nepali Times, The Wire, and Himalayan South Asian, among others. In 2012, she won the Journalist of the Year Award, Sri Lanka's topmost award for working journalists, and was a global recipient of the Wash Media Award 2014. Without any further ado, let me now request Ms. Dildukshi to chair the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to join all the young scholars in our part of the region. Can you see me now?
Yes, yeah? Yes, we can.
Okay. I think it's absolutely a privilege to chair this very important session that looks at climate change and to bring young scholars to take a look at a topic that is really relevant to this world, and also to bring in perspectives from different scholars whose work we will be briefly looking at today through this discussion. We intend bringing perspectives from 8 scholars today, and I would like to first set out some ground rules for engagement before we get started. First one, all the speakers will be allotted 7 minutes of speaking time. You will be reminded around the sixth minute, and I would request the organizers of the event, in case they tend to exceed their time, so that to prevent other speakers from losing out on their time, to maybe we could mute at that point around the 8th minute. We also want to keep about 20-30 healthy minutes for discussion after all of you make your presentations. So please bear in mind there will be people who join us during this discussion who would want to hear more from you. So let's give them some time, keep them some time to engage with all of you. For posing questions to our audience, this message is to our audience. Please do not raise any direct questions, so you can actually put them in the chat box. I will pick them up. And we would like to start now properly with maybe we have Anehi Mundra, let's start with Radhika, who's a student at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education, India, who will be speaking to us about climate change-induced migration in the South Pacific. complexities and analysis. So you have 7 minutes, please. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Radhika Jain. I'm currently working for James India as a research analyst, and I just completed my master's in international relations from Mahi Manipal. So while researching for my master's thesis, I narrowly covered the issue of climate migration and refugees. And I found it to be a very complex issue that needed more focused study, and I could find very little data to work on. So this brings me to my topic for today, that is refugees migration in South Pacific. Next slide. So I would like to start with a map of the 12 independent countries of the region that I'll be referring to. I'm not looking into the dependencies in the region, just the independent autonomous countries. What makes this region stand out for me is its geographical location. So as you can see, it's located within the Ring of Fire, the wider ambit of the Ring of Fire. While the issue of climate change is a problem worldwide, it seems to be more imminent in the Pacific. Being part of this active geological fault line makes the region environmentally sensitive. Now, apart from the small island countries are economically vulnerable and more dependent on external help compared to others. Moving on. Most literature dealing with the impacts of climate change in the South Pacific focus on direct implications, such as sea level rise and frequent tropical storms. These can seem more imminent, for example, when the cyclone April alongside COVID-19. It was really difficult for many countries, especially Vanuatu and Tuvalu, found it really difficult to manage. But looking at the direct impacts of climate change, drastic change in weather and climate patterns have had a major impact on economic activities such as fisheries and culture. This can be due to several reasons, like saltwater intrusion, which is basically intrusion, and deforestation of coral reefs. And it is necessary to give equal importance to these indirect consequences of climate change, because factors such as economy, infrastructure, disaster response system, and societal behavior of each individual nations in the region plays an important role in solving the entire issue. Moving on to the next, I'm looking at migration. So the migration patterns within South Pacific region can be divided into several, but since it's just 8 minutes, I've made it into 2. Firstly, in-migration or relocation within the country. An example is a planned relocation of a village in Fiji called Peter. I'm sorry, I cannot remember that. Second, short-term migration, mostly by skilled laborers to developed countries for better livelihood. So this is more socio-economic based. Now, I have included a table. So this table links the impact of environmental change to migration and loss of livelihood. Migration can be forced or induced, as I've already mentioned. Forced migration is mostly triggered by changes in the environment and requires communities to relocate as a whole, while induced migration is more individual based. They're basically people seeking for better livelihood due to socio-economic issues that they're facing, which are increasingly being affected by climate change nowadays. I know it's a big table, but it's basically everything that I just said. It's the environmental issues that are affecting migration, and then people are relocating or migrating due to those reasons. Now, moving on to the next slide. Most of the small island countries of South Pacific are heavily dependent on external aid and assistance. This brings me to the last section of my paper, that is regional and international responses to the issue in hand. Regional responses can be looked at through 3 different perspectives. First, responses of individual nations. This is mainly done through well-planned disaster risk reduction and policies that deal with relocation and migration. Most of the South Pacific countries have now planned out. They have a well-planned disaster risk policy. And for example, Kiribati uses the policy of migrate with dignity to help people relocate, especially the native community, because native tribal communities do not want to leave their homeland. And that is a major issue which people need to consider in policy making. Second, it is important to look at regional organizations, such as Pacific Island Forum, Pacific Island Development Forum, etc. They can help in creating a collective response system. They are doing so nowadays, but there is no proper framework or a plan of action that addresses every section of the society. And that brings me to the third point, that is the role of regional powers, such as Australia and New Zealand. Now, these countries cannot be neglected. They are major powers. They have great support, and they create in the region, as in they need, these small countries need major powers assistance. And China is increasingly being seen in the region and it's becoming a major player. While these countries do provide immediate assistance during climate crisis through disaster risk, through HDR activities, they even have a migration policy for skilled laborers. They're still not tending to the most vulnerable people who generally belong to the unskilled category of fishermen or farmers who are used to, maybe for example, farmers are generally used to cultivating a particular crop. So this crop.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt you, but your time is up. Your time is up. Would you just quickly wrap it up?
Yeah, I'll wrap it up. So these people are not addressed. And one of the main reasons for the lack of proper framework can be seen as an absence of a written legal definition. The issue of climate migration is increasingly being addressed in international platforms, but they still do not have a proper
Radhika, sorry to interrupt you. We have 30 seconds for you, please. You'll have to wrap up soon. Thank you.
Yeah. But what we need today is a comprehensive plan of action that looks into the need of the region specifically and starts reconstructing the issues beginning from the native community. Now, this regional policy and response system should be in sync with an international framework that provides necessary aid and assistance to these small island countries. I'm just hoping that I could. This will be done with time, but it requires more active participation.
So thank you, Radhika. So we will move to the next speaker now. Sorry to interrupt you. We just have to move on. So we will catch up with you during the chat time. So we have our next speaker, Anehi Mundra, who is a PhD candidate from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. She will be speaking to us on climate change and the rise in mass movements in India. A very interesting topic. So over to you, Anehi.
Thank you so much. So I will not waste any time for my introduction and just start away with it. I have realized it's very little time. So I start with, with the global movements, the global mass movements initiated with Rachel Carson. She is one who wrote 1962 Silent Spring, and that is how climate change and environmental issues came in the public domain. She mentioned the impacts of pesticides, and by 1992, DDT was banned in USA. The global movements around the world have mostly emerged from the developed countries for obvious reasons, because most of us come from developing countries here, so we understand why the global movements have emerged from developed countries. For example, Earth Day in 1970 was one of the initial protest movements across the globe. Eventually, they have taken up for Fridays for Future, school action, school climate strikes, and others. Recently, we have realized that everyone is joining the climate movement across the globe, be it NGOs, students, individual people, young, old, without any age bar or age gap. But one thing that strikes me immediately is there's a difference in how we view environment and how the Western world view environment. The Oriental realm, we don't see environment as a dichotomy. When you read Rachel Carson's work or any other Western scholars' work, you will realize that they see wilderness as a luxury. And that luxury is maintained through their environmental movements. They are trying to maintain the wilderness as a luxury in their part and protest for saving the environment and conserving the environment. It is strange to believe that the rise in global temperature can impact the social movements across the globe. This rising impact of environment and climate change has come to our doorsteps. We see the rising air pollution, water pollution, plastic usage. It all becomes our everyday problem. And that's why each individual has initiated their own consciousness to work for these movements. The global movements, they start in the either by one person, be it Greta Thunberg's protest across the world, or be it a global collegium of people fighting for. Recently, I was a part of global training. It was organized by former US President Al Gore. And he is also one of the active people in saving the environment, which made me realize further that NGOs also have a very important role to play in rising climate mass movements across the world. It is not only individual or people or our self-consciousness, which we popularly believe is impacting the environment movements, but also what NGOs and people with their agendas coming up with it. I will later on explain it with an example which I came across. Climate change has become a buzzword now. Anyone who has anything related to environment will surely put climate change. I came across this research work which mentioned that people to get funding, people to get their paper accepted in academic conferences use climate change as one of the important words in their title for presentation. There is a very good work by Professor Mark Schwartz. He works with the University of California, Davis. He explains the pressure for sustainable future is driven by issues like income inequality, environmental injustice, habitat loss, pollution, overexploitation, etc. The tactics normally people use are citizen science, activism, lobbying, creation of community organizations, and their campaigns are mostly related to species protection, plastic ban, reduction of wastage, poverty alleviation. All this create a pressure for sustainable future for most of us. When coming to environmental movements in our country, the recent environment movements, which I can name in this 1 year has happened, is one is Dehing Patkai for Assam, Save Array for Save Array Forest in Mumbai, Right to Breathe in Delhi, and Save Sundarbans, which have been going on for a long period of time in West Bengal. When I was researching for my thesis for Dehing Patkai in Assam, I realized that there are both sides of the story. When the individual organizations and people are coming up with their movements, there are also people who want to save the coal mining companies. They do not want them to just go away because they will also take away their livelihoods. Their chances to survive in very minimal conditions, especially in a condition like pandemic when most of us have reduced our livelihood options and opportunity. The Dehing Patkai movement took us an all India platform level, especially with the usage of social media, with the involvement of different celebrities like Dia Mirza, Adil Hussain joining it. But there were at the same time, there were also people from Margarita town in Assam who were protesting and saving the coal India. So whenever we come to see across the social movements in the country, be it Narmada Bachao Andolan for Narmada under Medha Patkar, be it any other movement, for example, another movement taking place in Chennai for saving alligators, another movement taking place in Chambal region for saving alligators. We need to see both the sides, be it NGO induced, is it for individual benefits, is it needed, what is actually needed. I want to leave this presentation with 3 important questions. Is social movement need of the earth when capitalism is rising and there is an increasing divide between rich and poor? How do we see these social movements? Because the more we strike for a social movement, we also need to know that they are also regulated by certain people. I'm not being a very pessimist here, but I want to bring this side. Social movements are very important for democracies or not even a democracy across the world, because each one of us required to put an opinion. Another question I will put, is it feasible for few to suffer? For all to suffer, for few rich people across the country or across the world? Environment versus development debate has been going on for long. We cannot find a very packeted or strict rule between choosing one, but we need to identify a midway in between both the ideas of how we can totally save the environment without becoming without falling under the role of development. I also cannot leave at this point of time the role of future technological innovations, be it social media, be it renewable technologies, be it technologies which are alternating to what are polluting the environment right now. So finding a balance between all these things along with social movement which can go across borders, people and localities, one need to identify. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this crisp but very thoughtful presentation. Thank you for your thoughts. So we move next to Shreya Shaw, who's a student at the Pondicherry University, India, to speak about something really important. And I think this is one of the biggest stories that we've been reading about in recent times. Why Assam's biggest flood disaster is associated with climate change. So we would like you to tell us why it should be linked. Thank you.
First of all, hello, all of you. I am doing my master's from Pondicherry University in Politics and International Studies, and I have already worked with NICE previously. And currently, I am as a senior researcher of Frank Creation Netherlands. So let's begin my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to talking about that why India's northeast region, Assam's biggest flood disaster, is associated with climate change. So, is it visible, right?
Yes, Shreya, but if you can focus a little bit, your camera so we can see your full face. Thank you.
Is it fine?
Yes, it's perfect.
The river Brahmaputra cuts northeast India's biggest state Assam into two halves, the North Bank and South Bank. Every year, Assam faced devastating floods during the post-independence period. Assam faced major floods in 1954-62 and 2000, 2004, 2014, and recently 2020 also. According to Government of Assam's report 2020, the average annual loss due to surge in Assam is to tune rupees 20,000 crores, and particularly 1998. During the year 2004, it was about 771 crores. This becomes the natural phenomenon for this region, but why it's occurred year after year? So the thing is, what are the reasons behind that the Assam has suffering major flood disaster? Okay, so what are the reasons behind the Assam has suffering flood year after year? The river Brahmaputra, embankments, Dehing and Patkai, and the Kaziranga National Forest and Tiger Reserve. So now I am going to talking about the river Brahmaputra. The largest river of India's northeast, Brahmaputra, is both lifeline and menace to Assam. It has a large river systems of multiple channels and water bodies crisscrossing large parts of Assam. The Brahmaputra originates from the Amshi Glacier located in the northeast part of the Tibetan Plateau Himalayan. In Tibet, the name of the Brahmaputra is the river Yarlung Tsangpo. After that, the Brahmaputra steams eastwards parallel to the Himalayan, where it arrives at the Namcha Garhwa, which is mountain in the Tibetan Himalaya. Then it entered Arunachal Pradesh in India in the name of river Brahmaputra. Along the way, in Assam, several river streams join the Brahmaputra, namely Shubangshiri, Rongli, Hai, Dikong, and it has many other tributaries in its north and south banks. As I have already mentioned, that the Tibetan Plateau is the highest and most abundant in the world, 4 to 5 meters above the sea level. From the top, when the river Brahmaputra arrives towards the low valley or plain land in Assam, it contains a large scale of fertile and soils within. According to the IPCC report, climate change efforts rise the global temperature in worldwide. Also, the Himalayan glacier mountains are melting very high. As a result, all these rivers and tributaries of the Brahmaputra are overflowing way above their dangerous level. As a consequence, the neighboring plain and low areas of region are very severely affected by seasonal devastating monsoon flood that affects the livelihood of the Assam. For instance, the Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna River basin. Now I'm going towards the point embankments. Embankments are the temporary flood measures. Assam governments have spent crores of money upon it year after year. For flood control in Assam lacks a comprehensive vision and long-term planning. For instance, the largest river island of Majuli on the Brahmaputra now reduced to 50% of its size. Erosion elsewhere reduces the landslides of Assam every year. In 2008, the North Lakhimpur, one of the flooded areas in Assam, it has reported earth embankments that at best the temporary flood measurement measures till date over 400 kilometers of earth embankments have raised. But when Brahmaputra breaks its banks, these embankments come down like a house of cards. The same embankments crossing several crores of rupees raised the next year again. The aid package came same sometimes after a year, then things are going to back normal as usual. Out of a total land area of 7.8 million hectares in Assam, more than 2.8 million hectares of 36% of total areas is affected by flood measures. And because the river of Brahmaputra is becoming so devastating year after year, to the large scale of melting glaciers of Himalayan mountain streams, which affects the region of Assam a lot. Now I'm going to the point about Tehing and Patkai. The rich biodiversity of Northeast India is a matter of concern. Tehing and Patkai Wildlife Sanctuary, called Amazon of the East Rainforest Element Reserves, for the rich biodiversity of this land. Tehing and Patkai landscape comes under Indo-Burma biodiversity hotspot for its rich flora and fauna diversity. The landscape is home of various IUCN listed species like elephant, Royal Bengal tigers, others, and there we can also see there are 239 species of birds, 30 species of butterflies, and 47 species of reptiles, and others so on. Coal mining in Tehing and Patkai is now a matter of violation of the Forest Conservation Act 1980 and Coal Mines Act 2015. The Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change that provide for industrial and infrastructure projects within the wildlife sanctuary. The ministry has proposed a new set of rules, that is the Draft Environmental Impact Assessment (EIA). The National Board of Wildlife passed a recommendation of coal mining in January 2020, which is the threat of the biological diversity upon the region. Now I'm moving towards the point of Kaziranga National Forest. Every year, flood is essential for the UNESCO World Heritage Site recognized Kaziranga National Park. The annual flood is good for its wildlife sanctuary. In 2016 to 2020, Kaziranga faced national high floods. As a result, more than 60% of the park underwater, hundreds of animals were killed and injured. The state government of Assam should take major steps on the World Heritage Environmental Sanctuary like Tehing, Patkai, and Kaziranga National Park. Mostly seasonal floods, mostly when the flood lines have crossed its level towards unsafe. And as a conclusion, I would like to mention the digging and coal mining works should be barred soon in this Kaziranga National Forest in Tehing, Patkai, the region of Assam. It causes the seasonal flood more dangerous harm upon lands and environment. The lowland areas near the river Brahmaputra take management and measures to control upon the making houses and buildings, as well as it impacted the ground more and using embankments. The IPCC has recognized the health threat, nature threat, and water threats will be our next generation's problem. Hence, we need to take a step ahead, not to act and not to react, but act. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you for your very thoughtful presentation. Just want to move to the next speaker, who's Rashmi. Rashmi is from, she's a PhD candidate from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, India. And she's going to give us the connection to climate change, give us a global connection to climate change, and she'll be looking at breaking the ice. Will the Arctic be the next emergency frontier? And I guess there's a great connection coming from Nepal for most of the, for NICE and for people from Nepal. This would, this would be something that resonates with your thinking. So let's hear you, Rashmi, next.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Good afternoon, everybody. I will straight away move to the topic. let me just share my screen. Trump administration in August 2020, that's the previous month, gave its green signal for drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Alaska. The controversial move is not a brainchild of this government, but but it overturns the existing provisions that protect the Alaskan wilderness. So it represents an idea that visualizes Arctic to be the next energy frontier. Keeping this as a context, I have titled my presentation, Breaking the Ice, Will Arctic Be the Next Energy Frontier? Through the course of the presentation, I look at 3 specific questions. First, what makes the Arctic attractive? Second, who are the major stakeholders? This will be a brief profiling of who are the major players and what they're doing in the region. Third, is Arctic a viable option at all? So what makes the Arctic attractive? The findings of the CARA, or the Circum-Arctic Resource Appraisal, which was conducted by the US Geological Survey in 2008, revealed that the Arctic holds approximately 20% of all the world's undiscovered oil and natural gas. Though this can be considered as a breaking point from where the interest in Arctic resources saw a new surge, the interest began well from the beginning of 20th century. So Canada was the first country to begin exploration and extraction of resources. The CARA also said that the estimation was at 90 billion barrels of oil, 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. In addition to hydrocarbons, Arctic also holds reserves of rare earth minerals and other metals. Now, the idea of extracting resources in the region has become more attractive due to climate change. That brings me to the second point. Climate change has the ability to alter the economic profile of a country and a region. And this is the key element in inducing something we call it as the scramble for the north. The melting sea ice in the Arctic is uncovering resources and also the shipping routes, the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. Of course, the Northern Sea Route is more operational compared to its counterpart, Northwest Passage. The major stakeholders. So all the 5 littoral states or the coastal states of the Arctic Ocean are involved in resource exploitation. Russia is the biggest and most important player simply because of the 3 reasons. It has the longest coastline with the Arctic Ocean. The resource distribution is skewed towards it, especially the natural gas reserves are towards the Russian territory. Third, the NSR, or the Northern Sea Route, passes along its coast. So naturally, Russia is at an advantageous position. We also have to remember that Russian economy is not very diversified and it depends on resource exports for its revenues. So Arctic plays a crucial role in it. The United States is involved in the exploration in Alaska. Prudhoe Bayfield is one of the biggest in the continent, and of late US has been showing more interest in resource extraction. Canada, however, which started as the first country for extraction, is not very active because environmental concerns take over the political landscape and have pushed the government to discourage production, especially in the offshore oil fields. So they're more into mining of minerals than hydrocarbons. Norway extracts oil and gas from Northern Sea, Barents Sea, and Norwegian Sea. But hydrocarbon exploration is very controversial in Norway, and the criticism comes well within, because being a Scandinavian country and talking about climate change on all international platforms, a country like Norway, depending on revenue from a petroleum export, is something what the domestic population itself cannot take it. So there is a lot of environmental pressure from the environmental groups within Norway. Going next to Greenland, I talk about Kingdom of Denmark here. We must understand that Greenland is part of Denmark. Greenland has swaths of rare earth minerals, and but the possibility of presence of oil and gas is very less, and the focus is now on development of rare earths. This was a brief profile of the countries, but is Arctic a viable option itself is something that it's a food for thought. First, speaking about the economics, the resource market functions on pure economics: investment capability, production cost, transportation cost, access to market, demand, pricing, profitability, so on and so forth. So considering these economic parameters, there's a need to understand if Arctic is a viable option. First, considering the cost of production. So the discoveries of onshore and offshore resources, particularly the hydrocarbons, may be considered as a positive, promising development, but extracting them in a very complex environment is challenging. So climate change is definitely there, but the permafrost penetration is still a challenge for countries. Also, we must understand that the climate in Arctic will require ice class vessels, will require special technologies that are still not yet completely developed. So it's a discouraging factor, definitely. The next is the volatility in demand. Recently we saw prices going up and down, especially the oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and even during the pandemic, the prices of hydrocarbons have come down drastically. For any producer to produce, the price at the market is an incentive, and if demand is volatile, definitely going to a region like Arctic and producing resources is something very discouraging. The third one, I'm going to speak about risk of oil spill and consequences. We all remember, I think it was in last month, Russia saw a very big oil spill within the Arctic Circle that was in one of the rivers. Thankfully, it didn't enter the Arctic Ocean. So the risk of oil spill is always there when there is oil extraction. Especially, it endangers species and the present biodiversity of the Arctic. And this is the primary reason for environmental groups to protest the recent decision to allow drilling in the Alaskan Arctic. The last but not the least is climate change. If we think that the pandemic is the biggest challenge in our lifetimes, I'm very sorry, it's the climate change that has the worst in store for us. So it has the most severe disasters we are seeing in front of our eyes. And drilling in the permafrost in the Arctic will release the methane, which is a very potential harmful greenhouse gas. And second point, there is a lot of international pressure on the countries to reduce carbon emissions, which have resulted in stringent legislations that prevent exploration in ecologically sensitive regions. Let me give a small example of the Obama administration, which brought the stringent legislation that made Royal Dutch Shell, a company, close its operations completely in the Alaskan continental shelf. Now, on the other hand, Canada also has tweaked its legislation to keep the offshore hydrocarbon fields off limits, and I mentioned that Canada is not very active. So on a concluding
note, have to, yes, okay, you can have 30 seconds to conclude, please.
Yeah, on a concluding note, I would like to say that Arctic is a promising ground, but it has its own limitations before it could become an energy frontier. In the interest of the region and the planet, subsiding the projects in the Arctic is necessary until risk-averting technologies and methods are completely developed and are nearly foolproof. There must be some incentive for the producers to internalize the costs. Until then, we have to keep the Arctic away from this energy domain itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will move to our next speaker. Suprita, you're here. Suprita Suman. She's from the guest faculty from the Patna Women's College in India.
Yeah.
She will be speaking on melting of polar regions and implications of the blue economy. So you connect with the previous speaker a lot in terms of part of the topic that you share. So over to you now.
Melting of polar regions and its implications for a blue economy. As my last speaker, my friend, she has already talked a lot about Arctic. So melting of polar regions. They have a climate change in the polar regions and its global implications. Actually, melting of polar ice caps has made has some implications like increasing in the sea level and loss of marine biodiversity. And one of our third pole, Hindu Kush, is melting. That is going to cause water-starved Asia. And third is the increase in natural calamity. All the three poles, melting of three poles, whether South Pole, North Pole, or it is third pole Himalaya, that is going to cause, contribute in increasing the frequencies of natural calamity. But what are Same time, they are going to be the regions for conflict. Like my friend has already discussed that it is Arctic is the basket of resources, all the valuable resources, hydrocarbon, minerals, and marine resources also. So the international governance is itself facing lots of challenge, like power play has started in the Arctic because Arctic is being surrounded by powerful NATO nation and a giant size Russia. Another is there is lack of any organization with the legal framework with enforcement capacity. So being very particular about the topic, and now I wanted to explain what is the blue economy actually. According to the World Bank, the blue economy is the sustainable development of the ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods, and the preserving of the health of ocean system. But in practical system, the blue economy doesn't follow the norms of sustainable growth, and there are lots of cases we have heard about oil spill in the oceans. So it includes all the marine and offshore activities like shipping and cargoes, fisheries, aquaculture and marine biotechnology, oil explorations and seafood extraction activities, research, tourism, and renewable energy if we are producing energy due to tides and waves. So this is also a type of ocean blue economy. So what is the connection between the paper will explain that what is the connection between the climate change or polar melt with the blue economy. So implications of polar melt on the blue economy. Though the retreating of polar ice has been a serious implication on the weather and climatic condition, marine diversity and biodiversity, but it has facilitated the blue economy in many ways. First, with the softening of surface ice, now the resource exploration and extraction has become possible near the Arctic offshore. Second is ocean tourism. It's a pristine beauty of Arctic has attracted, and Antarctica near Southern Sea has attracted the tourists very much, and these polar regions are emerging like tourist destination. Third, the last is melting of ice sheets of Antarctica has lowered the ocean warming, benefited the marine life. When the ice sheets of Antarctica is covered by thick ice, and when these ice sheets are melting, these cold water are running towards the Southern Sea and the Indian Ocean, and it has checked the problem of actually ocean warming. Though the sea level is increasing, but ocean warming is being controlled. So in such situation, there is a good condition of breeding of fish and other marine lives. So the polar melt has some implications. Now the first, I will discuss about the Arctic, which is the most sensitive indicator of this ice melt. And this represent actually the North Pole represents an ocean. So connection with the blue economy is connected with the oceans. So I'm first discussing about the Arctic. Melting of the Arctic has boosted the opportunity in blue economy, especially due to melting of sea ice. The Arctic Ocean, the Arctic and the Arctic sea lanes are now open for the global commerce. They are going to benefit from these. Actually, this has been claimed, or it has been measured also, that these Arctic lanes are shorter routes between East Asia, from Eastern world to Western world. And the global commerce will be benefited due to this shorter route, because this will consume less energy and less time consuming. So the price of export and imports will be trimmed off. Another is offshore drilling has become possible, and thus the extraction of hydrocarbon is now easier. Mine drilling in the Arctic region has become possible, and fishing is also become easier. But there are some adverse implications of the blue economy in the Arctic. First, pollution due to increasing human activities, which is very established and no need to explain it. Loss of marine diversity. Definitely when the Arctic has a very fragile environment, and there are so many type of whales like killer whales, blue whales, bow-headed whales. There are specific species of whales which has been, for which the Arctic is known. And especially polar bears, they are losing their habitat actually. Another, the depletion of marine resources due to overfishing. Arctic is the Makkah for fishing. It is full of good because the Arctic water is has a containing snow containing oxygen containing capacity. So fishes are very good. This is the source of very good quality of fishes like Atlantic cod, Pacific cod, snow crabs, silver crabs. So this is the fishing, many fishing countries, the littoral nation, as well as the countries like Japan, Korea, and China, they are very much interested in doing this fishing from in the high sea area, Central Arctic. So now the Arctic fishing has become so attractive that there is a threat that there will be a resource depletion in a very short time in the near future. Health vulnerabilities for the animals as well as the Eskimos also, who are the only living species on this human being who are depending upon the ice for their dietary need.
So Prita, sorry to come in. You just have 1 minute to conclude.
Oh yeah. I have. This is the finance. Yeah. Threat of spill is oil spill incidents, damage to marine life and food chain, and territorial disputes and militarization. That is very common. Actually, the two things is required to discuss. One already my friend has discussed, but there was an incidence of Action Valdez before 30 years, which was a shipwreck, and it has killed nearly 5 lakh animals, sea animals, which is a very difficult situation actually. So there is always a threat that if this incidence is repeated again, this is going to hamper the shallow area, which is actually, this is the area which is for the breeding of this Arctic marine food chain, and this can hamper the whole Arctic scenario. And south, like Arctic, the southern sea and Antarctica is also facing all this illegal fishing, tourism, and pollution and oil spill. So this is the question. This presentation leaves a question. Now this is the high time to calculate the benefit. Okay, economy is going to be benefited, but there is a cost also, so future cost. So this is the first time that human has to calculate the risk and benefit, between the risk and benefit. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We would like thank you very much to all our speakers. We are really grateful that you shared your perspectives. We have a little bit of time because we have a little bit of leftover time. So we just want to have a very quick second round of thoughts from you. So of a maximum of 2 to 3 minutes by each speaker. So can we have Radhika? Can we have Radhika? Radhika is here?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, you can make a second, you can make some concluding remarks. Short burst, 3 minutes.
So my research basically looks at climate-induced migration in South Pacific. And so the term migrants do not have an international legal definition, and that is the root of my research question. So why is that still not there? And I believe that this is going to be a major issue in the future, near future, especially for South Pacific, being very environmentally and geographically vulnerable. So what we need to make is a comprehensive plan of action, and it has to be very region specific, as most of these countries have its own issues, and it has to also include all types of people, not just skilled laborers. It has to include unskilled people, the tribal community, and then and with this regional policy, there should be a response system with an international framework. And we are working towards it, but it needs a lot of push. And something that I find, especially when it comes to South Pacific, not many people would talk about South Pacific because I don't know why. And I think that there is a need for active participation by scholars. We need more field work, which is very less. And because of that, it's very difficult to get data, especially when it comes to the correct number of people who have migrated to maybe developed nations. And then we also need to make an accessible policy making community, and there needs to be a sync between these two. So when it comes to South Pacific, this is something that I would really like to see in the future. So yeah.
Thank you. That was comprehensive, but still very brief. Thank you so much, Radhika. So we would like to hear from Anehi. Anehi, are you here? Would you like to share your second set of thoughts in like 3 minutes?
I never thought that I'll get another chance to present myself, but I'm really happy to do that. So I wanted to make a few points about, since my presentation was on social movements and climate change. As of now, we cannot dissect climate change and environment because almost they are linked to each other very closely, and in a lot of aspects, there are so many linkages that are not even identified by the present researches that are going on. Even the IPCC report cannot say 100% to the linkages they already mentioned. In their reports also, they put very high confidence. So research needs to be go further. But at the same time, there are other social and political factors which are impacting many theories and ideas around climate change around us. These pointers I shall put as social media. The role of social media cannot be left out in such a scenario. The role of pressure groups, the lobbying groups, which especially the lobby groups in USA, they have their lobbying is very strong, and they actually have a very strong impact on how climate change negotiations take place across the globe as well as within the country at the domestic level. The recent fight, there has always been a process of finding a green political party, but there is a recent trend of voting for a party which is green, which supports our ideas, which supports our views. And there are a lot of NGOs currently working in creating that kind of motivation and opinions. We have normally seen that the right-wing governments or the conservative governments do not support environmental causes very much, and that's why we see an increased number of social movements in that direction. With the rise of social media and pressure groups and international NGOs with borders vanishing, it's easier for us to find these voices openly and closely. There are open governments which are actively working for climate change and issues connected to it. For example, Maldives is a very good example in South Asia. A part of my research for a PhD has also included Maldives work on climate change, and then I have realized that when there was this Mohammad Nasheed's regime, his party is in the power, but when he was actively in power and he created his own documentaries and created a global level stir, at the same time there were also local stirs in Maldives, where there were movements in Maldives when people used to come out and speak to the parliament, speak to them, and then they used to inculcate their voices, their ideas in the policy making process for environment and climate change. So one needs to identify such governments also, such social movements also, and we can also take inspiration from them. India is a vast country. Our geography, our dynamics, our politics, our social society are very different, and they change at every step, from one state to another, even within states. Such social movements will be keep occurring irrespective of government, especially in a time when climate change is a stark reality and we see it every day in our lives. More research in identifying what are social movements, how they can actually change the course of the politics of coming future is much needed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was brief, and but you gave us so much to actually munch on. So we would like to talk to Shreya next. Shreya, are you here?
Yes, ma'am, I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. So if you would like to share your perspectives within the next 3 minutes before we open the session for questions.
Yes, like at the time my internet was not properly, so that's why my presentation was stuck. So yes, I missed 2-3 points. I was talking about the Tehing and Patkai. Okay. And in my presentation, what I found that environmentalists, climatologists, ecologists, and various kind of scholars have already mentioned that the coal mining was the biggest threat for this natural habitat and environment and climate change issues like the region for Assam. And the National Board for Wildlife has already permission to the Coal India Limited for extraction of 98.59 hectares land of Selki, which is belonging to the Dehing Patkai Wildlife Reserve. And also the forest region is also the habitation of the dozen different ethnic groups, including Assamese communities, Thai Peka and Nepali people and other tribal peoples also. But the central government is trying to harm the environment of Dehing and Patkai, as we all know. Recently, the massive tree cutting for the coal mining, it can bring a countless threat of the Himalayan belt region of the Assam. And after a year, the gigantic floods of Assam in monsoon season, it becomes distressing. Hence, this coal mining, this rampant tree cutting, destroying the natural diversity and animals also can create a cause for uncertain rainfall, heavy rainfall, or climate change fluctuation among the Himalayan belt regions. So yeah, this is my concluding remarks, you can say.
Thank you. Thank you for keeping them brief as well. So we next have Rashmi. Would you like to build on your shared perspectives for the next 2 to 3 minutes, please?
Yes, thank you so much for this, ma'am. I have 2 points to share. One is the myths surrounding the Arctic economy and resources. So once in 2008, when Russia placed its national flag below the North Pole on the seabed, people started talking about, the Arctic is going to be the next frontier, either for energy or for militarization, and etc., etc. But I think there are a lot of myths surrounding it, and even in my presentation, I told that it's not very encouraging for the companies and producers to go there and easily invest in what we call as the Arctic market. So that's one thing. There are a lot of problems associated with it, especially with the cost of production. The second point is in 2018, there was an agreement called as the Central Arctic Ocean Agreement. This was a political tool, and all the Arctic countries except Finland and Sweden, and even countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, we weren't a part of it, unfortunately. But all these countries came together and came together with this agreement called a CAO agreement, which bans fishing for 20 years in the Central Arctic Ocean. Now, the Central Arctic Ocean is as big as Mediterranean Sea, so it is a major portion of the ocean. So that puts a full stop on the fishing episode itself. My point is something like that should be there on energy and resource extraction also, because this is a very sensitive issue when it comes to climate change. One, it just contributes more and more to the carbon emissions. The carbon footprint of every company increases, and there are no costs for and there are no incentives for internalizing the costs. So a political solution for managing the resources and the disaster management is necessary, something on those lines of the CAO agreement. Yeah, that's it from my side.
Thank you so much. So we have Suprita. Would you like to also explain a bit more and build on your perspectives from the previous presentation?
Yes, ma'am. And I did my PhD on Canadian Arctic, and I have there was a ban on fishing. Mm-hmm. Like my friend has already mentioned, but it was done in 2016, and the process has been initiated in 2010 only. But actually, no country is following this, and Arctic is already militarized since the World War II, when Hitler has blocked this, and at that time only NORAD was established. So Arctic is already militarized. Lots of I think Arctic is the first ocean which has faced the nuclear contamination during the Second World War. So the Arctic fishing, my perception is that there are lots of organizations working on this. They are coming with the suggestion, but in reality, what happens that no country who is going to be benefited from the blue economy, that is going to follow any of the rule. There is in international law, the power is the rule, might is right. Russia is the biggest polluter in the Arctic region with the oil spills. I think 7 or 8 incidents Russia has been responsible for this. And Norway is a major fishing country, and Norway was first to adopt the straight baseline case to reserve fishing in its boundary. So I think there are so many organizations working on polar melt, but all 3 poles, I think all the poles are being studied separately. So my perception is that the implications of all the melting of all the poles are almost same. So there should be a perspective to study all the poles from the expert point of view. So studying only one pole is not sufficient. There are some similarities, but there are lots of specialities and diversities also.
Thank you so much. So I think we move to the next part of the session, and that is to take questions. So we already have 3 questions, but unfortunately they are not particularly directed to one speaker. So I'm going to need the help of the other moderators who are supporting me on this, because the questions are not specifically directed towards one speaker. There is one question. The world's biggest polluters are, this is from Facebook, the world's biggest polluters are not ready to contribute a bigger share for climate change. US is not committed to it. How can we protect this world? So I think this is a very open question. If I may direct this to, who would like to take this question?
I can take this question.
Okay, please do.
Ma'am, I'm giving the answers in the Arctic perspective.
Yes.
It was the superpower. Arctic is the first place where the 2 superpowers are close neighbors, that Russia and Russia and America. So this is the real corridor where the superpowers are confronting with each other. And these were 3 major incidents happened. One was Exxon Valdez incidents. Another was Russia has dumped nuclear wastage of nuclear submarines in near the Norway, and the coolant sprayed, and the fishing ground was so much polluted that it was warned that the person who is the people who are going to be the consumer of these fishes, they has to suffer from number of diseases. Maybe couldn't detected earlier, but in a long time they have to suffer. But Russia and Canada, they were not at all ready to establish any organization working on environment. Even when Arctic Council was negotiated, they were Russia was ready, but US was not ready. When they wanted to make it legally abiding, so there should be any norm, America clearly refused that. If that is going to happen, America will not sign this agreement. So Canada, as a middle power, it faces lots of problem, that bringing all the countries on the common platform, that environment is the critical problem for the Arctic. This is the high time when the Arctic started melting. This, and now our one block, that is Eastern Bloc, after Russian disintegration, it has already damaged. The world was unipolar, and Russia was, then America has put lots of question, lots of pressure that Arctic the Arctic Council should not be a legally abiding institute. It was not ready to sign that it should be a talk on this security matter. So it was very much clear that America wanted to be the power player in the Arctic. It wanted to be the key player of the Arctic on the basis of muscle power, not as a guardian, not as an environmental, not our sensitivity towards this environment. And no treaty was initiated. And regarding this Arctic per se, no treaty was initiated by America.
Okay, but Suprita, I want to reframe this question for you again. Yes,
Yeah.
I know you shared the Arctic perspective, but what about our part of the world? What about our own contribution to the to this question? Answer this question, because we have been debating this, the role of the United States and the Western powers, and we also have certain responsibilities towards preventing climate change. So, what about our own superpowers in this part of the world?
I think India should be penalized for this, because India is not checking, by not checking its population. India is going to pose the biggest question on environment. This is India being sitting in underdeveloped country, it asks for so many excuses that it is an underdeveloped country. But I think the population of India is the biggest problem, and our responsibility much more than including all these northeastern continent and the European continent. India is going to be okay, we are consuming the things which are made in the European industries, but we are consuming, so we are also responsible for this. Our part is also, we are not taking lead role, but India is the largest contributor is going to be the largest contributor in pollution.
Thank you, Suprita, for giving us perspectives from both ends. Is there anyone who wants to add perspective to this?
Can I add to it?
Yes, of course. Of course, Anahim.
As Suprita was mentioning, it was a unipolar world, and today it is a multipolar world, especially when China is rising. How can we avoid China, especially coming from Asia, and we cannot put our hopes on it? India has to do more, but I personally do not think it is only population. We have to do more at all the levels. For example, a National Action Plan on Climate Change needs to do much more than that, what it is not doing. And so with all other countries, especially the small nations like Bangladesh and Nepal. Actually, there are so many NGOs working in Nepal for climate change. So each nation, each small nation is working on its own. It is the responsibility of bigger nations like China, India, which are one of the most populous in the world. Not only India, but we all have to come together to take part in it. Just like cannot leave it. I understand that US is not taking the due measures that it should be, but there are other European countries which are, for that matter, they are shifting to renewable sources of energy, be it solar or any other sources. Apart from that, there are elections in America this year. There is a lot of hope coming up. It cannot be so, I think, just anti one country or just bring back the
actually I was talking about the Arctic, dear. So in Arctic, nowhere, Canada, China is not an Arctic nation. So I talked about the whole perspective that was Arctic suffering, and America was taking no initiative, which it could have. I think it was capable. And Russia was at that time disintegrated. And in Murmansk's speech, already Gorbachev has explained that Arctic should not be, it should be a zone of peace.
Yes.
Environmental issues should be. So it was the time when Canada was negotiating, and it was being scolded by America, and like in a table, sitting on that table, it has to face a lots of problems due to presence of that.
But all of us here, we know, right, that US always behaves this way, be it Arctic, be it Pacific.
Well, beyond the generalization, I think many countries have a role to play, and all of us have roles to play. And whether we are playing those specific roles is something that we should consider. And there's a connected question. Again, we have gleaned it from Facebook. Well, Nepal lies between two gas chambers, India and China. How can Nepal pressurize both and make them accountable to climate change impact? So do we have any takers for this question? Anyone?
I can add a bit to it.
Okay. So Anna, you can go first, and anyone else, Radhika, anyone, feel free to just add your perspectives quickly. Go ahead.
Nepal is surely a sandwich between two major nations, but there are a lot of NGOs working in Nepal. I haven't seen many other countries in which so many NGOs are working for environment at one go simultaneously, and they're working for 10 consecutive years very actively, especially I think post 2008, since the Constitution of Nepal has been formed. So I think those NGOs can play a very important role. For example, there is an NGO named ICMOD. It is placed in Kathmandu in Nepal. It's a collaboration of 8 countries of South Asia, including China. And because countries like India and Pakistan, they do not communicate with each other directly, they communicate on the scientific data through these organizations. So these organizations, the active non-government organizations in countries like Nepal, can play a role in mediating between countries, and hence they can also gain power in the climate negotiation, and they can also probably put bigger nations to work with this tool. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm also going to ask some questions. Anyone else who wants to add your perspective to this?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, Anehi, like ICMOD, I wanted to talk about ICMOD.
Yeah.
So, initially also in my presentation also that there is no legally abiding governance or governance organization regarding the pole. I wanted to repeat again that Hindu Kush Himalaya is our 3rd pole, and ICMOD is working on the building resilience and adaptability in all the affected communities which are living reason. But this ICMOD has no power actually, or no enforcement capacity. It just can give suggestion. This is the main problem, that all the laws, environment is critical for the health of the planet. Still, all the laws relating to environment are just soft law. No one is legally abiding. These are conventions. These are not laws. So this is the main problem, that the governance level is it's very fractured and weak. So it is very difficult. It's a very challenging, and one of our very good known scholar, Ives, she has told that there is a science to make the suggestion, but at the same time we need a governance to enforce it, which is not here. There is an absence of governance. So this is a question that whether is it a possibility to make such organization and founding this organization, and if not, what are the challenges? If yes, then what are the good prospects of this?
Anyone else who wants to add to this answer and give us more perspectives? If not, we take the next question. Okay, so this is directed to all speakers, but ideally, if we can have someone who did not speak during the question and answer session, it'll be great, but it's all open. Yeah, the climate change is real and grave. Still, why have the countries failed to express their seriousness through proper implementation of serious policies? And I think, Suprita, you just touched on that. That's exactly what you were talking about. I just want to add something else to this particular question and ask, how do you propose that we deal with climate skeptics? Because there are climate skeptics. For a long time, the negotiations have been impacted by, the world is divided, and there are those of us who may believe of climate change impact, and there is another section, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, who do not believe there is actual climate change impact. So this has been one of the biggest debates, and I think there have been many environmental NGOs that have tried to bridge this gap and build this understanding. And that's also when people like Mohammed Nasheed played a critical role in showing evidence. So this is about evidence and showing evidence and saying it's happening and it's real. So globally, every state party has a responsibility to deliver on commitments. So the question is about commitments. If climate change is real and grave, and some of us are really feeling it, how do we move forward? How do you make state parties responsible? How do we make them parties to an understanding? As we have gone through several rounds of negotiations, which haven't given us a good enough result. Anyone who would like to take this?
I'll take that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so I believe that most countries are creating policies which are more need-based, depending on climatic changes that are affecting them directly. So, and there are certain countries with a solid plan, while others are just going with the flow. For example, developed countries like Japan and South Korea make ambitious plans like zero carbon emissions, etc. But it's more contradictory considering their actual emission rate and their high dependence on coal-based industries. But there are also other countries, like from a South Pacific perspective, there are countries like Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, that have effective disaster management policies because they need it. And people are protesting against mining companies, especially the new frontier of deep sea mining. And so I think it's more need-based right now. And the problem that we're facing is because the issue of climate change is global, but then the international policy-making community has not made it global yet. We're still looking at it from a national point of view, which I don't think will work for climate change. And it's a slow process, just like how healthcare system was not given importance until COVID-19. So I think that's something that we need to, that might be one of the reasons why we have an issue there.
I'd like to follow up with a question to you directed to Radhika. We are building on what you just said. But you were talking about small island states, and they are a grouping, and they do lobby, they advocate. So there is some understanding based on, of course, their shared problems, and it's about their needs, true. But they are also making, they're creating a dent in that whole discourse and raising awareness. And so you also have champions of, those who champion this cause as well. Well-known personalities like former President Nasheed. So, are you suggesting that there will, if we stick to this needs-based approach in our policy making our frameworks and our programs, we will never really find a global solution, because we have been discussing climate change for the past 20 years. So how long must we engage in conversations and negotiations and not see a solution that helps us? Because something seems to be going wrong in this world, right?
Yeah. So I would say that need-based approach is not going to solve the issue of climate change, because the issue is, the determinants are different. I'm pretty sure most of the small island states in South Pacific is not the root cause of climate change. So we need everyone to equally. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can hear you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So that's. Oh yeah. So since the cause and effect is actually different countries, we need a complete consolidation of the entire international community, and I don't see that happening very fast, because generally international conventions take time. And but I'm very hopeful. I just hope we don't have to face something like COVID-19 and then change and completely shift our focus to climate change. I just hope that doesn't happen. But I see this continuing for next 20 years probably till actual effect starts coming.
Thank you, Radhika. I just want to quickly pose a follow-up question to Anahi. So the question is based on the thoughts that you shared. Just want to ask if we are going to have a needs-based approach and we are going to look at issues that we face as a country in dealing with climate change, how can we mobilize? You noted that there is mass movement, migration induced by climate change. So if people are feeling impacts of climate change to that level, how can we raise awareness? How can we have a bigger voice about how people actually at the ground level experience that, and how do we upscale that kind of understanding to a broader discussion where we can share, we can certainly bring other actors on board. And the next question would be, what specific role can social media play in these times where the young people, young activists are getting engaged through social media platforms? How can we push the climate agenda using social media platforms?
Okay. Thank you so much for your questions. First, I will go with the need-based approaches. In today's time, even a single person can bring out a major change. So if the governments want to bring a change, they can surely do it. And I think NGOs are very, especially in mass movements and environmental mass movement, to be very precise, they play a very active role these days. One may not realize how they are working so effectively, but since a part of my research is based on them, the NGOs have worked very, very effectively. In the place from where I come from, the central part of MP, and there is one of my case studies for my research on climate changes, Jhabua. It is a tribal district area in this vicinity. And I have visited that area multiple number of times, and they are working. There is a kind of social movement going with people, and then government has also involved themselves with it, because the local people have come up with so good ideas. The traditional knowledge, especially in our region, has come out so effectively that government has also started becoming a part of it. For example, then they were addressing the people, they were also the mayor of the city, the MP of this locality, the MLA of the locality were also present over there. So I think the need-based approach can be more effective if NGOs are working efficiently. I'm not sure how good every NGO will be, how reasonable people will work, and there will be no hidden agendas, but they are a very important role player as of now, what I could understand in the climate debate. Second question that you have raised about the social media, I think every possible social media site for people of our age and younger people is very active. Be it TikTok, we may not realize, but there are TikTok videos also for saving environments. There are Instagram posts every day for saving environment. There are so many organizations, so many individual change makers working at all level to reach each and every person. I totally understand that it's not possible for all of us to have a smartphone every day, to be so active on social media. But I have traveled to interiors of Bangladesh, and people were active about climate change and how social media has given them knowledge. So I think it's very important role play, just that how we make use of it. For example, right now we are making use of it by speaking in different countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have a follow-up question. I'm building on what she said from what Anahi just mentioned, and just want to ask. So from what you see, Shreya, how has people's understanding of climate change impact in their daily lives changed? Because if they do not make the connection, they're never going to be convinced that there is a problem. And it's also very important, while policymakers and those who create frameworks and action plans understand this and create systems that work in the best interest of their people, it's also very important for people to understand this. Because I think there is a growing consciousness and an understanding in all our countries. But how do you create people's understanding? So the earlier thing about the social media platforms being, a possible vehicle to reach people, the younger people, even if everyone is not connected as we would like them to be. How can we build people's understanding of climate change impact? So they really are the biggest group of stakeholders in this. So how do we bring them there? How do we give them a bit better voice, a bigger voice, and an influential voice where we can actually influence policy and policy? Shreya, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, yeah, I can hear you. First of all, I want to say there is a third question, right, regarding this climate change, and the countries are not serious about the issue. So first I want to add one point for this question, because what I think that I can say about India, because I'm from India. So it's okay. So the thing is, what I feel that for India, the government is not concerned about climate change. It is clear. Okay. Now I'm telling you why. Because the thing is, countries like in international arena, mostly countries are relying upon realism. Okay, so countries are more making their policies towards that balance of power and their self-interest. So the topic climate change is not giving them that much kind of limelight. I am talking about that developing countries, not that developed countries. So for India, if you are going to say that if this time, like if climate change will be our voting agenda, if I can say, so the people maybe they will not understand, because for India, what I have understood, apart from that climate change or that poverty or that education or economic, besides that, government is more interested towards that caste-based politics or the caste-based agendas or this kind of things, you can say. So yeah, and however, what I understood that countries like US, okay, UK, they are very much, I'm not going to talking about that they are extremely sensitive about climate change issues, but yes, they are thinking about that climate change issues, that yeah, okay, fine, it is. And also Ireland or Norway, to some extent they also think about that, okay, fine, climate change and environmental issues are important in this 2020 scenario, when IPCC or United Nations organizations have already, published such kind of reports that we are in a danger position. We need to save our Mother Earth. So in that manner, I can say that it depends, okay, because we have to accept the reality that countries are more, talking about the balance of power and their self-interest. And for India, I would like to say, because for Indian government, no, it is very much lenient towards that nuclear weapons, towards that Rafale jets, or towards that, that kind of these things, but they are not sensitive about all these things, our education sector or our poverty or our women harassment in after in COVID-19 era. And one more question that you are talking to me, that the social media, yes, okay, the social media platform is very much influential in these days, but what I understood, just a post or just a share post or okay, fine, it can change, it can give it a change, but the main thing is you have to start by your own, because if one person thinks that he or she will not use plastic bags, not that much, or just a simple thing, when I will go for shop, okay, when I will go for shopping, if I will carry like a bag, okay, by my own, then I will not, need to collect from there. So this kind of small things are very important. So we need to start it from our home. Social media is fine, okay. Social media or international organizations or international, that INGOs also. And one more thing, that these organizations or these INGOs are good, okay, they are fine and they are doing well. But we need to remember that they have some certain limitations, they have some certain aims and objectives, okay. So that is why one I can say that one organization is thinking about that we will do only for that poverty, or we will do we are more concentrating on towards that Amazon rainforest. But countries like Bangladesh or countries like India, they are not that much kind of sensitive, I can say. I'm not going to talking about that people of these countries are not aware about this issue. Yes, we are aware about the issues, but the thing is, the government, the policies is not, they're not doing these things properly. So that's why there is a limitation. Okay, there is a limitation, and yeah, that is the thing. What I feel personally.
Thank you so much. But before we conclude, I just want to ask one last question from Suprita.
Yeah.
So we talked about the role of the individual and also about the power balance and how countries basically position themselves in climate negotiations and why they do so. But one of the key things, and something that came out of your presentation and certainly links and builds on it, is when we talk about economic implications, there is also a connection to food security. And if you speak about the Arctic, which you mentioned as being highly militarized, it's also very important. Climate change is impacting and can impact the economy in a big way because of the fisheries industry, because of multiple other industries. How can climate change awareness can be enhanced if we have greater discussions about economic implications to nation states?
Yeah. Ma'am, if I'm not wrong, so you have asked the question that how to make a balance between the economic gain and climate change.
That's right, yes.
So this is before few years back, if there was a popular term, sustainable growth. There was a concept of sustainable growth. That means whatever we are going to consume, is there any possibility to produce it in the most effective, cost-effective manner? In a manner, it can harm the ecological balance at least minimum. If we cannot manage all, but it can be minimized. One example I'm giving in Bihar. I'm living in Patna. So few years back, Patna, this North Bihar was completely a mud land, and it was producing water chestnut, which is called makhana and singhara. So what happened due to now we have made highways, and now these mudlands are actually, they have gone somewhere, and now these have converted in agricultural land. And now what is happening? Now they are producing pulses, they are producing commercial crops, but water chestnut, it has gone from the market. So there was the possibility that it could be maintained in a mudland. There was some ratio should be kept as a mudland, but no, that the people are actually, in a very brief manner, that I am saying that there is a difference between citizen and population. We have population, but they are not citizen. The moment I will understand what is my responsibility, I will be a citizen. But if I'm not understanding it, I'm a population. So there are people are elected. One very good example, flood water that is coming in this season from Nepal. Actually, Nepal is a hilly region, and there is a Tarai heavy rain in Tarai. So water has to log in UP and Bihar. So every day the bureaucrats are getting report that this water cannot be managed. Yes, it can be managed. I have suggested in my letter to my CM that why we are not making this blotting paper effect, that why we are not making the rainwater harvest in a local level, on the roadside, so that all this water can be absorbed for the future, and there will be no need to destroy the monsoonal crop in Bangladesh, and there is no need to open the Farakka in the flood season. And in arid season, we are not giving water to this poor country, Bangladesh. But no option was there. It has went, it was just a letter, and it was treated as a vestige of paper actually. So this is the problem, ma'am. There is every aspect is economic aspect. Even bureaucracy has its own economy. So why not bureaucracy is taking responsibility? This is the reason that in the name of flood relief, they are getting heavy fund. And this fund is, major part of the fund is going in the pockets of bureaucrats. Why they are going to give the plan to check this flood impacts implications? They have to get benefited from this flood. So why they will? There is a solution for every problem, but there is a benefit. Sometimes the policy makers has to be benefit. Sometimes the bureaucrats have their benefit, and sometimes never think that the victim has their own benefits, and they are working for their own benefits now. There is a benefit of every section. So economy is actually a big machinery where very much of the wheels are running. So we have to cast the right switch to switch off the right wheel actually. So this is not happening, and it's not very easy in the global system, but it is very easy to work on some principles, like whether the agriculture, whether it is river flow, whether it is making a pond, where it is a making of road, where it is a planting a tree, all can be done. There are few norms. Okay, these norms are not mentioned. It is not hardcore norm. But before this, people were living. People were working on the, like indigenous people. They have preserved pokhara for them. But in Bihar, North Bihar, the pokharas have gone somewhere. There are well without water. Bihar is a country without, in Gaya, North Bihar is flooded and the Gaya is dry. It's a drought. It is facing drought. There is a distance of only 5 districts. After 5 districts, there is a drought and there is a flood. So there would have a water preservation unit. And since 20 years, when I was a student of 10th examination, I'm writing to the government. But there is a solution that in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh relation can be managed through this manner also. So Bihar government is saying, why should I? It is the central government responsibility. The government will say it is an international responsibility. So everyone is shifting the responsibility to other shoulder. Nobody is ready to, nobody is coming in front actually. And if people are ready, so in a democratic country, they have no power. NGOs have their own limitations, sometimes funding limitations, sometimes expertise limitation. How many NGOs in India can afford the technocrats working on this? So there is a need to work, people cooperation, there should be enough funding also, there should be technocracy and there should be governance. Then the 4 pillars can do better in the climate change. That 4 has to come.
Thank you, Suprita. I'll just have to cut you short because thank you on that wonderful note, and thank you for this really highly engaged discussion where you shared your perspective so willingly, and you brought in all of you brought in so many diverse perspectives, and we were able to collectively build a discussion. I hope that benefited our audiences out there. Just want to thank all the speakers, the organizers. And I also want to say a special thank you to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for asking me to chair this delightful session. So passionate, so engaging, so interesting. I learned a lot from you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, John. Thank you. Good day.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. Pranjal, are you there? Pranjal?
Yeah, I'm there.
Please proceed with the vote of thanks.
Distinguished speakers, chairs, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the 6th session. It is my honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NICE to all who have graced us with their presence and contributed their parts to make this event a resounding success. First of all, we would like to express our profuse gratitude and sincere thanks to Dildukshi Handuneti for agreeing to chair the session today. A sincere thanks also goes to all our speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such a comprehensive and convincing presentation. We are really honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live on a YouTube channel. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making the session productive with your questions. We are truly honored to have you all with us this evening and hope to stay connected with you in the future as well. It's really been a pleasure. Also, do join the next session. Thank you very much.